There's young people. Okay. Yeah, no. So if you would please let people know out there in the hallway enjoying coffee and tea that they can join us if they want to study. I have a new topic that actually was brought up and requested, something that was asked of me. Would you please consider talking about this, because a lot of people have it on their minds, and that's a conversation that will be very helpful and fruitful to them. So I thought, okay, I'll do it. Fantastic. So just as you're here in the room and some people are still yet to join us, let me ask you a quick question. How many of you are familiar with a theology that's out there? Maybe you know it by name, maybe you don't know it by name, but it's out there. It's called distinction theology versus non-distinction theology. Never heard of it. Okay, it's kind of a new thing. So let's put it this way: the non-distinction theology is an old thing. It's been around since, I don't know, about 2nd century of the Common Era. And it's, a lot of church fathers has accepted those kinds of ideas, and they took that theology into some very, very unhealthy places. And then there's a distinction theology, which I actually think is all throughout the Bible, if people just choose to read the Bible for what it actually says. But we'll talk a little bit about it. What I mean is distinction theology and non-distinction theology, and we'll be getting more and more into that as we go along. Is that, yeah, it's kind of, but let's just put it this way. Distinction theology recognizes that there's Israel and there are nations. There's distinction. It's that simple. And that's like all throughout the Bible, right? And so you would think that would be normal. That everybody would, like, who reads the Bible would say, yeah, sure, that's what it says. Of course I believe it. It's right there in the Bible. But then there are people who believe non-distinction theology, meaning that Israel has no special relationship with God. Israel is just like everybody else. They're meeting God on the same playing field as all the other nations out there. And so it's a very, very common theological perspective that exists today throughout various branches of Christianity in particular, because, well, believe it or not, the New Testament is what leads people into this direction and that form of thinking. And so if you reject the Hebrew Bible, if you reject the Old Testament and just say that's really not important, and you only focus on the New Testament and you read that and you interpret everything through lens and prism of that, then it's actually not that difficult to arrive at that sort of thinking. If you discarded like 80% of the Bible, okay, that's what you would have to do. You'd have to like basically be a New Testament Christian, basically, where you just basically say, okay, all these other things don't matter, or they need to be radically reinterpreted, they need to be rethought, they need to be recast, they need to be rethought and re-explained. And that takes a lot of re-explaining. So it actually takes a lot of effort to do that.
Right.
Yes?
So question, when you say distinction theology, I'm not familiar with that term, but is there maybe a synonym or maybe multiple synonyms? In other words, if it's a distinction in time, so many Catholics, for example, and frankly many Protestant denominations hold a view that God worked through Israel, but then rejected.
But no, not anymore.
Not anymore, right? So sometimes called covenant theology.
So they have historical distinction that they hold on to. They hold the historical distinction, but that distinction ended for them. So basically what they are today is non-distinction theologians. They accept that there's no difference, that Israel has no special status, no special standing with God. The covenants that Israel had were canceled, done, finished. So all I have to say to you is that you could see the implications of that, because the existence of very Jewish people was built, and the identity of Jewish people is built on these very covenants that are supposedly canceled and obsolete now. And so how do you deal with that? How do you define yourself in ways that God did not define you, and choose to define yourself in some nondescript ways that, God's word doesn't give you? So that is a new paradigm that people try to spring. So you understand, when I say non-distinction theology, what I'm really talking about a lot of times is any form of replacement theology, any form of supersessionism. That's what I mean. But the term that people do not know is distinction theology. And that's a new type of theology that I believe needs to be taught, needs to be explained, and needs to be embraced. And the more Christians actually embrace that theology, I think we can move towards kingdom that way. because without recognizing the role of Israel and the role of Jewish people in God's plan, I'm sorry to say, that's been tried for almost 2,000 years, and how are we doing? It didn't get us anywhere closer to where we should be as a people of God all throughout this world. So while there are good things that happen with the gospel, then there's also very bad things and negative things that happen. And I'm not going to even start listing them, because I do list them enough on 9th of Av and all that kind of times. Yes?
I'm just going to observe that, within the Protestant sphere, the irony of a particular theology called covenant theology, it's literally like an Orwellian term, a doublespeak, right? Or
yes, it is a doublespeak, yeah. And that's the whole idea, is to spiritualize everything and to make everything into a metaphor. And that's the only way you're going to make it work, because you can't actually read the Bible for what it says. You have to read it as a metaphor of the whole entire spiritual experience. So nothing is what it is, it's something else. Really, that's what we're talking about. So we'll talk more about distinction theology, no distinction theology, and we'll get into more of the nitty-gritty later on. But what I want to do is I want to lay out for you an idea. And I call this teaching One God, One Faith, Three Roads, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to examine eventually three different roads that non-Jews take. You can guess what they are. These are famous people. They're in the Bible. But they really believe in the same God, and they have actually the same faith. It's just how they go about it is a little bit different. And I think it's fun to look and compare and contrast and think about it in a broad scheme, and then to see what makes it different, and how is it possible that they have slightly different roads that they go. And the roads do not have to be divergent. Like over here, you have two little paths. Obviously, these are the tires that just wore out, right? The road. The roads can actually be parallel. And they can be reading in the same direction. It's just that there's two little paths of people walking beside each other. They don't have to be walking on the same road, bumping into each other and trying to shove each other aside, saying, no, my road. I don't want to get into the mud. I just want to stay on the path. And then that sometimes happens where you actually can walk beside each other. And sometimes if enough people walk beside each other, they wear out their own separate path. And that's sometimes what happens. So it's not a bad thing necessarily. So I'm going to show you two paths, which are actually three different paths that exist out there theologically that I want you to see. So let me begin by saying, and I want you to clarify this for everyone. When I say one God, one faith, three roads, my discussion is about our spiritual path in life. That's really what I'm talking about. It is not about how we encounter God, or it's not about your spiritual birth. It's not about that moment of you coming to face the reality of God. That's not what I'm talking about. There's only one way for that to happen. There's only one way for a human being to encounter God. And you do that by Almighty's grace and through your own individual faith in God. You have to believe in Him. And that God is always there for us, and so we can come to God. But the only way for us to encounter God is actually one way. So when I say three roads, I don't mean three paths towards that sort of experience. What I mean is that these three roads are practical. They have to do with how one lives their daily life now that they have encountered God. How one sees themselves in relation to God and other people. These are the paths that people take, the paths of faith that they walk every single day in their life. That's what I mean. So when I say three paths, I don't mean three different, roads that kind of lead to God, because that's not what I'm trying to say. So if you understand me right, then you will understand my teaching a little bit better. So let me begin by presenting this topic and this idea of unity and diversity. I don't know if you had much chances to think about unity and diversity, how people define unity and how people define diversity. I would hope that most people would understand that diversity means different. And unity, of course, it means united. But the question is, does it mean not different? See, unity and diversity. That you can actually have unity with people who are not like you. And that's what I am trying to present, because that's what I think Hashem actually wants us to have. You see, non-distinction theology says that shouldn't be. We should all be the same and relate to God in the same exact way and be defined in the same exact way, and then we can have unity, because we're really the same. Well, yeah, that's one way to achieve unity, But wouldn't it be a much greater and much more powerful display of unity if you create a unity among people who are not alike each other? And I think that is the vision that Hashem has. I think that is the vision of the prophets, and I think that's the vision of the Bible. I think that's what we encounter. I think that's the vision of Yeshua and the apostles and the writings that they have given to us. All sorts of indicate that way. But it doesn't mean that people will not take those writings and twist them into whatever they want them to be. So we're going to be smart and we're going to think through them together. So there are some concrete reasons why I believe the elders in Jerusalem, which are mentioned in Acts 15, and Apostle Paul all agreed that non-Jews who embrace faith in Jesus do not have to become Jews, start living as Jews, but live in harmony and solidarity with Israel. Are you familiar with the Acts 15 scenario where the apostles have this big meeting and they have to solve a problem? And the problem is, what do we do with all these non-Jews? It's not that there are millions of non-Jews, but there are a few thousand of non-Jews, primarily in diaspora, primarily in places like Galatia and Antioch, who have embraced their faith in Messiah, a Jewish faith, a faith based on, faith that is based on Jewish covenants, faith that comes from the Jewish prophets. And everything in that faith seems to be connected to Israel somehow, but they have embraced that faith, and that faith has transformed them. It changed them. It changed them from pagans, from idol worshippers, to being monotheists. And their lives have improved dramatically. Big surprise. God actually tells us, if you follow my commandments, good things will happen, right? So that actually happens. And so now they're living these lives that are much improved. But the apostles, they don't quite know what to do with them, because the status quo in Judaism, the way we work outsiders in, we just convert them. We make them into Jews. We create unity by forcing uniformity. You know, you didn't know Hebrew? Okay, it's time for you to learn Hebrew. Now you don't eat kosher? All right, it's time for you to learn kosher. And that's how we keep cohesiveness of our society and our structures, by basically asking people to conform, right? And there's a formal process of how to do that. And that's the way you get integrated in the community, and that's what's done. So that is as old as dirt. We get that. That's what happened in the past. And so the apostles are faced with that decision of having to take all these non-Jews living in Antioch or somewhere in Anatolia and turn them into Jews. But that's a very difficult thing to do, because guess what? The Jewish community in Anatolia, well, it's not very strong. There's not a lot of Jews out there. So how are thousands of these non-Jews going to learn how to be Jews? From what? 5 Jews that are living in there? No. They need a community in which, if they are a minority, they could easily become a part of it. But if they're a majority, they're not going to learn what Jewish life is all about, because they're going to outnumber everyone. And who are they going to learn from? It's not like there's books. Right. Judaism for Dummies. 1st century CE, you know. It's not like you can go and pull up a website like Wikipedia. How should Jews, or what do Jews believe about this? You know, like, you can't go there. So what are you going to do? You're going to go to your Jewish neighbor, right? You're going to go to your rabbi. You're going to go to people and ask them questions. But what if you don't have that? You don't have those people. And what if the Jewish neighbors that you have, they're so Hellenized? What if they're not really even super Jewish Jews? You know, what if they're kind of sort of trying the Greek way? So you see, this gets complicated. So within Israel, that's a different story, because you get outnumbered, because there's so many Jews who are zealous for law, and they're going to live the Torah, and they have the opportunity to go to the temple, and you kind of flow into that life, and that can happen. But when you're outside, it's difficult. And then the world outside is also pressing upon you, and they're saying, why would you want to be like these people? Why do you want to be like them? We have a religion that's way more superior. I mean, look, God has given us victory over the whole world. I mean, look at Alexander the Great. There's a reason why he conquered the world. You know, he knows what he's doing. So why do you want to go with these people who obviously lost? So there's a lot of dynamic in here that I want you to realize. But apostles decided a very pivotal decision. They decided that non-Jews who embrace faith in Jesus do not have to become Jews. They could stay the way they are. They don't have to start living as Jews, but they have to still learn how to live in harmony and in solidarity with Israel. That means they live with Jews, the way they are. But there might be some adaptations and some harmony has to be created they will have to do if that's what they need to do. So the reason why the apostles decided this is that the presence of God's Spirit in the believers from the nations, the fruit of the Spirit, the fact that they have changed, the fact that they have abandoned idolatry, the fact that they've abandoned sinful behaviors of all sorts in their lives, okay? That's what I call the fruit of God's Spirit living in you. It's a transformation that we cannot achieve at our own will, but God makes you want to abandon a behavior that you otherwise would have liked to continue, but you realize God is not pleased with that, so you say, you know what? I want to please God a lot more than I want to please myself. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop doing that because apparently it's not good for me. I didn't know, but now I do. So there's this transformation that happened, and all of that signaled to the apostles that they were accepted by God himself in their present, call it uncircumcised status. So they didn't have to become Jews and all of a sudden there's this fruit of the Spirit in their lives. All of a sudden they start keeping the commandments. All of a sudden they start changing. They become more ethical people. It was the other way around. They became more ethical people. They became better people. And then they were starting, well, maybe we should consider circumcision. And that's meaning conversion. Circumcision is just a mnemonic device for conversion. That's what we're talking about. That's how it was done. So the apostles say, if they already have the essence of what we are, or what we should be, then why do they need that cosmetic alteration, essentially, to be that? Can they just be non-Jews who follow our God? Is that such a wild and crazy thing? Is that so unusual? Yes, maybe that's not normal, but guess what? It has been done. It was being done in Israel throughout history, and it still continues even today. So maybe some of you heard about B'nai Noach. B'nai Noach is a movement that exists today alongside of Judaism, non-Jews who are worshiping God, following the commandments of Noah. So I'll talk more about that. So here's a verse that's important for us to understand. And I'm going to teach you how to read things in a different way. It's the same verse that you probably read before. This is from one of Paul's letters to the city of Corinth, to the Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 12, if you read that, it's a famous chapter. It's known to be Paul's teaching about the gifts of the Spirit. Okay? Maybe you've heard a few teachings on that. But that is not all that's in that verse. It also teaches about diversity of callings in God. And it talks about unity in that diversity. I know everybody's focusing on the spiritual gifts, but I want you to put that aside, just bracket it for a second, and read it with a new light, with a new sense. And listen to these words. So this is Paul writing to Corinthians, chapter 12, verse 12. For even as the body is one, and yet has many members, and all the members of the body, though they are many, are one body, so also is Messiah. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit. For the body is not one member, but many. So what I want you to see here, number one, is diversity. Diversity is the foundation of this teaching. He says there are many members in the body. Body is not one big giant eye. We're not an eyeball. We can't even walk around if we were an eyeball because we would need legs, right? For that eyeball to walk. So we're not in that. We're rolling on the floor. So body is not one body part. Body is made up of multiple body parts and it works together. There's a diversity within a body. So when we say the body of Messiah, because just like the body of Messiah is supposed to have multiple members, Israel is supposed to have multiple functions, multiple people that are making it up. This is no different. It's the same exact language. And what Shaul is saying here is that these members of the body, they're tied together. They're unity. They are one body. Just like a person would be one body. So he's using a language of our physical being, right? Body language here. And then he says in verse 13, it says, by one Spirit they were baptized into one body. This really confuses people a lot. let me translate it into normal English. It says, by one Spirit, meaning by the Spirit of one God, they were all immersed into one body. So, and baptizo or immersion, or it basically is a word to identify with. In ancient Greek, that was the word that used for like dyeing a piece of fabric, for example. If I wanted to color the whole entire piece of fabric into purple, or multiple pieces of fabric into purple, I would stick it into a vat with purple dye, and it would all become purple, right? That's the idea. So this is what that word is. When I use the word baptism, or when you see the word baptism, automatically people think of a religious ritual where you get sprinkled or dunked or whatever is in your mind when you hear the word baptize is. But guess what? This is just an actual common Greek word that is used outside of a religious context, by the way, all the time. It's just that we made it religious. We made it into a ritual where you have to have that thing or whatever that happens, however the ritual happens, in whatever tradition you're familiar with. But you realize the word baptizo is a Greek word that actually occurs in non-sacred context. So what would that mean? Well, I know we translate it as baptized because we basically take the Greek word because we don't have an English word that's close enough, and we just make a new one. And that's what word baptized in English is. It's a transliteration of a Greek word baptizo, which means to identify with or to become one with. To fuse, essentially. That's what you're talking about. So I know I'm taking you outside of your religious thinking right now for a second, but you have to come to a synagogue to get out of your religious thinking, by the way. So in one Spirit, okay, they're all made or fused or identified with into one body, meaning God's Spirit is what made them into one body. Remember what happened to Adam? And it says, and God breathed His Spirit into, and he became what? A living being. Nefesh chaya. So this is what he's talking about. All of these body members came together, just imagine them, pulled together, nice, united into one actual cohesive, what we call body, and God is doing it by His Spirit. And then He's explaining that there are Jews, and there are Greeks, they're slaves, they're free, they're different. Slaves and free, I'm sorry, they're different. Jews and Greeks, they're different. I realize that when people read this verse in the church, it means absolutely nothing to them, because nobody in church is a slave or free. And nobody in church, there are no Jews, not enough Jews in the churches, so that kind of like doesn't even matter. That doesn't even get into, doesn't make it as a footnote into explanation, because we don't have any Jews here, so we don't have to worry about that. And if there are any Jews, well, we already told them they have to become Gentiles, so don't worry about it. That doesn't exist. Just forget it's there. But it is there. It is there, right? And why is it there? Because in the first century, there were Jews, and there were Greeks, and there were slaves, and they were free, and they were treated differently. And they understood that though they had differences, when they came together, they were one cohesive whole. And they could have unity regardless of the differences they have. And yes, there were a lot of differences between Jews and Greeks. And yes, there's a lot of differences between slaves and free. But those differences are set aside. Why? Because we're meant to be one in Messiah. That's a beautiful apostolic teaching. And I know people want to make it all about gifts, but I want you to see unity in diversity here. That's what I want you to see. One body, many members. Then we actually are a body. If we're all eyeballs, it's one big, huge, giant eyeball. You realize it. I know it's gross. I'm sorry. I have to use these examples sometimes. You understand, hyperbolic teaching gets it across. If I use an outrageous example, it makes it very difficult for people not to understand it. So, Paul says that the functions of the body parts are like specific callings and functions of the people. Israelites understood this because they had Torah that organized their society into what I call functional groups. Torah organized society into functional groups. There are spiritual functions or callings or roles in Israel that were determined by God Himself. These were not something that people could take on or make happen or somehow make it so. They were determined by God Himself. Now, former pagans, they did not have this type of a dynamic in their world. They had classes, they had status roles. People always tried to move up. They were always competing, using alliances, seeking to achieve a higher status of importance and moving up in the world. So they always had that idea of upward mobility. But you see, in the Jewish spiritual thinking, you can't become a priest unless you're born one. You're a son of Aaron, you're a son of Aaron. If you choose to serve Hashem righteously as a descendant of Aaron, you're in line for a priest and you're going to be that. There is nothing, okay, that a Benjamite can do to become a son of Aaron because he is not. That's it. And so he accepts his position. He accepts his designated role as one of the Bnei Israel and recognizes that this person has the rights and privileges that he doesn't have, but he needs him to do certain things for him. For Benjamite needs a Levite to serve for him. He realized he can't be a Levite, so he's looking to God and hoping that this person will do what God intended him to do, and that is to serve as he's supposed to serve and fulfill the function that he's supposed to fulfill. So there are different functions in society that you have to understand that have been built into Torah. You are who you are, and you can't just say, oh, excuse me, I don't want to be that, I would like to be this, because I like this better. Right. Who chooses that? Do you choose which family you're born into? Do you choose if you're born, like, oh, excuse me, God, before you allow me to come into this world, I would really like to be a Jew? No, you're just born one and you can't help it. It's your parents, right? So it's not something you choose. Well, people try to unchoose it, but then there are always people who will remind you that you're a Jew anyway. So, so people will try to unchoose it, but it doesn't work, okay? That is our lot in life. So what else can I say? What I want you to realize is that Jews had this spiritual system built into a Torah. And this dynamic was implicit in their thinking, where pagans did not. So when Paul is writing to Corinthians, when he's writing to these former pagans in the city of Corinth, which was a fairly paganized city, they don't always grasp it. This meaning is not automatic to them. It has to sink in. They don't have an analogy in their society. They have status. And guess what? You can have a status. You can rise from a slave to a master. You actually can work your way up. You can become a free slave, and eventually you can rise. And even if you can't do it, your children can. And on and on. And we have stories of people rising up in rank in the Roman society. That has happened. All you have to do is have enough money to become a Roman citizen. And then you work your way up into the nobility class eventually. That's how it happens. So they understood that. And they understood that you can kind of have these things and come into these things through your own effort and achievement, where Jews understood that sometimes your roles and your callings, just you are who you are, and you have to stay in your lane and do what you're supposed to do. So there's this dynamic, and then in the middle of all that, Paul is teaching about gifts of the Spirit and all of that. And you can understand how that could be confusing, because that's what those verses in Corinthians really all about. They're about gifts of the Spirit. So here's a good one. 1 Corinthians 12. All are not apostles, are they? All are not prophets, are they? All are not teachers, are they? All are not workers of miracles, are they? All do not have gifts of healings, do they? All do not speak with tongues, do they? All do not interpret, do they? But earnestly desire the greater gifts, and I show you still a more excellent way. Shaul is a good teacher. Besides me trying to get into the nitty-gritty of this text, let me demonstrate to you one simple thing. Of course, he's talking about the gifts, right? And he's talking about the callings. How do you become an apostle? Can you just say, excuse me, sir, here's my resume. It says the apostle. I went to the apostle school. I got my apostolate degree, and now I'm an apostle. Like, do you achieve that? No. Do you just somehow earn it and work your way up to it? No. Either you are or you're not. Either you are or you're not. I realize that there are traditions out there that like to call their ministers apostles and that kind of stuff. No disrespect. That's their story. I'm sorry, that's not New Testament. That's not how it works. You may have an apostolic calling, you may have an apostolic gift, and you can have an apostolic ministry, whatever you want to call it, but the apostles are designated by God and, by the way, other apostles. That's how it actually works. They acknowledge you. This is how you become a rabbi, too, by the way. Rabbis designate other rabbis. You don't get to pick and say, oh, we would like this person to be a rabbi. No, the rabbis say he is a rabbi. Whether you like to hire him, that's a different story. So, are not apostles, are all prophets. How do you become a prophet? Either God gives you the gift of prophecy or he doesn't. It doesn't come from you. You can't just say, I want to be a prophet, I want to be a prophet, I want to be a prophet, I want to be a prophet. Come, call you, spirit of prophecy, come. Not going to happen. Either God's going to give it to you or he doesn't, right? So it's really not your choice. You could desire it, you can want it, you can wish for it, you can pray for it, you can ask for it, but it doesn't mean God's going to give it to you. And the same thing with teachers and all this workers of miracles. I mean, you can want all you want to be a miracle worker. You can. It's not a forbidden desire. It's not a bad thing to want to be a miracle worker, but whether God's going to give it to you or not, it's up to him. So please understand that there's this diversity of callings and functions that exist within a society, whether it's a society that's more secular or a society of faith, or however you want to look at it, however you want to look at the structure. There's a diversity. And a lot of times we have absolutely no control over which category we fall into. We can complain about it because we don't like it, but we are who we are, and most of the times you don't get to choose these things. You don't get to choose the spiritual gifts that God endows you with, is what I'm trying to say. And that's part of what Shaul is trying to do. As he's teaching about the gifts of the Spirit, he's trying to say you don't get to choose. Now he says, earnestly desire the greater gifts, meaning ask for it. Ask God to endow you with those kind of gifts. It doesn't mean he will, but it says, I'll show you a still more excellent way. And he goes on to another teaching after that. But what I want you to see is all of these people can actually work together. And not try to say, I am this, or I'm that, or I'm all this, or I know I'm a prophet, but I really, really, really want to be an apostle. No, he's an apostle. And he may have a gift of prophecy or may not. That doesn't matter because God is the one who assigns those things. So I'm trying to explain to you about callings and functions that are all in there. They're all implicit. They're all built in. They're right there in Paul's writings, and like I said, they're in the Torah as well. And now imagine the same exact logic, only replace the apostles with high priests, right, descendants of Aaron, and replace the prophets and teachers with Levites and so on and so forth. Take the same idea, take the same exact write-up, and just switch the names. It would make sense to you because you know the Torah, but it wouldn't make sense to an average pagan living in the city of Corinth because they don't know what a high priest is. Never met one, never knew one, don't know what's one supposed to do or not supposed to do. So substitute miracle workers with those who heal and speak in tongues, and interpret with other callings and functions of people within Israel. Just substitute those categories. And basically what you have is the same exact teaching that you have in the Torah. That some are called to do this, others are called to this. Some are called to do that, and they would all receive different giftings for a purpose. Because we're meant to be one big cohesive society working together and mutually benefiting from our different callings and purposes. But if we all want to be the same, we all want to be the high priest, well, who's going to bring the wood to lay it on the altar so that the priest can lay a sacrifice on top of it? The priest can't do it himself. He needs somebody else doing it for him. So it would be hard for Corinthians to connect to this type of organization, so Paul just uses body parts instead. You want to know why he uses body parts? Because that's something they totally understand. So that example, it talks about this spiritual body, this idea. Paul's a good teacher. He takes it and brings it to them where they are. So what I'm trying to say is that the spiritual calling or function is really not a social status or a privilege that can be earned. Either you have it or you don't. That's a new paradigm for a lot of people. And it definitely is a new paradigm for people who are reading 1 Corinthians 12. And I'm trying to help you see this by, it's in the text. We just have to allow it to speak to us in this way and allow us to be informed with certain presuppositions when we come to that text. Your presuppositions will determine of how you read and understand that text. And my job is to sometimes say, bracket these, use these. And all of a sudden, you're able to see something more. Is this helpful? Does that make sense? Okay, so you understand why I'm going there, because I'm going to talk about this idea of unity and diversity, that we can be different. And the whole Jews and Greeks that comes up here, there's a reason why that comes up, because that was actually first century dynamic that was there. And I talked about Acts 15, and this is what the apostles decided. They decided it's okay to have Jews and non-Jews worshiping together. Same God, one faith, one God, but a slightly different road. Still work it out with God, but how they go about it could be a little different, respective of who they are, where they fall, what their role is, and neither one of them is greater or lesser, because guess what? Like I said, if we were all one big giant eyeballs, it'd be a problem. We need each other to make it actually work. Otherwise, we're dysfunctional. We would be a very dysfunctional body. So all these metaphors, all these ideas, they're there to illustrate to us a core truth and understanding. And once we embrace it, we understand diversity as absolutely necessary. Absolutely. It's just, we can't live without it. Yes?
And it's interesting that if you look at, I mean, very frankly, God created diversity, right?
Of course.
And in fact, the earliest and most tyrannical form of human government was globalism, right? It was trying to unify humanity artificially and create a monotony. God said, no, you're going to spread out. You're going to have diversity. There's going to be people. You're going to have different languages. God created
There's a reason why God created the nations. Let's put it that way. There are 70 nations in the world, right? That's what the tradition says. And so there's a reason why that exists.
Even though a spiritual calling or function is not a status, it's not a degree, it's not something you earn, on the one hand, it is very possible to have a calling on your life and either refuse it or just be so involved in, being swept away in the culture that you never recognize it. And that's why we need to come together and worship and be taught and have our lives changed and strengthen our weak knees and, be discipled so that we get our lives in order so that we can.
We are meant to function in community. Let's put it this way. If you're very good about building things, okay, and I desperately need somebody who is good at building things, but you don't like to build things or you don't do that anymore. Right? You're just not something. So you just kind of give up on your special calling and talent you have. You're a person that's just amazing with these things. You're good with your hands. I'm terrible. And as a part of a community, I asked you, hey, can you help me with this? And you're like, yeah, I guess I can. And then you do it, and it's like, wow. I can't come even close to doing something like we just did. And you start recognizing, like, whoa, you really have something. You have an amazing ability that I don't have. None of these people actually have. You have it. And so all of a sudden you realize that you're actually needed in the community because you fulfill a very important function. Other people cannot fulfill as good as you can. That only gets found out in that moment of need in the community when you actually start being useful to yourself, to everybody else. If you just sit there by yourself, you'll never even figure out that anybody really needs you. So it's very easy to give up your function, to give up your gift, your calling, whatever you want to call it, and just kind of not use it and let it go stagnant if nobody's asking and you have no chance to contribute.
I want to say that there's a spiritual truth that a lot of us stay where we are because we can't see the whole thing, because we don't have control over it. But when we move in that direction and do a little bit, God shows us the next. And that we make ourselves available. And like you say, other people encourage, other people recognize that what we don't recognize. Mm-hmm. And, just speaking as someone who's been stuck in a lot of other stuff for a long time, I recognize that we as humans can thwart what God's offering to do.
We can. That's why we need community so badly. Jake?
On one level, I think that to some extent, whether it's politically correct or not, this is kind of a caste system. Whether you're a Kshatriya or a Dalit or whatever, and you're having to work out your dharma, that seems to be, you're kind of in your station. Right. Your lot.
Yeah.
But there does seem to be a few pivotal points in the Bible. It is not in any one generation so much. It's something that occurs, I think, in long stretches of history, where the family of Aaron wasn't always a priestly family, but they did something at Mount Sinai that garnered God's favor. Or the case of Pinchas, for example, spearing the prostitute. He did something very specific that earned God's favor. Israel, the same thing. Abraham, the same thing. And so it's like, well, these were all different epochs of the past. If you look at Joshua entering the land, there's this pivotal scene where they start casting lots. And this is going to be the portion in your land based upon, and much of the tribal allotments seem to be allotted on the basis of everything the tribes and the families did getting there. Their behavior getting there determined to some extent what their later fixed portion would be, to some extent. So I mean, it might sound in some way despairing to say, well, I'm an untouchable in this life, but it might be the fact that if I for like do my dharma or do my mitzvah, whatever, here, then there might come a day when God, in the future, casts the lots again and says, okay, you who, it says in Isaiah that he's going to take some Gentiles as priests.
Absolutely.
That's very specific. So it's like, well, what does a Gentile in the Olam Hazeh have to do to earn that kind of nachas?
Apparently those things are very real. So Drake is bringing out, I think it's an excellent point for us to understand. I'm talking about a paradigm. I'm talking about a picture. I'm talking about an idea that sort of works as a general principle. But please understand that there are always exceptions, and there always will be exceptions, and there will be these terms where things will not work this way. People always like to look at something theological and make it into an absolute truth. It can't always be quite that way. So when we have these teachings are meant to have some flexibility built into it, right? So like what the example he's citing from Isaiah, where God says in the end days he's going to take some people from the nations to be Kohanim. That's what it says. I can't change. It's right there in Isaiah. I have to face the truth and say, okay, there's this principle to this idea, but then at certain points, God decides, I'm just going to work things differently. Okay. Again, the system does not have to work perfectly every single time. Yes?
But that begs us to ask, what in this life would one have to do to be in Kohen Gadol, or, whatever, to be a Kohen of any kind, a Levite?
Shaul actually addresses that issue. He talks about circumcision, but then he says, but there's one thing that's most important. And then he tells you, it says, keep the mitzvot. That's what basically brings a lot of blessing into your life, and you have no idea what kind of blessing might come into your life because of that. Again, we can't see past these things sometimes, but I'm hoping that this makes sense. Good discussion, yes?
I'm sorry. So the way I see it is that when we strive to unite our heart with God's heart, then we get that passion that says, go kill that sinner and get him out of there, you know what I mean, the Pinchas thing. And so when we get that passion, because we are uniting our hearts to God, because we are steeping ourselves in God's word, that we respond because we respond a little bit, and then we get more grace, we get more Holy Spirit kind of enlightenment of what God wants, and it's like, for you, Drake, say, if you had never picked up a pencil, and would you be an artist if you had never tried it, if you had never used those crayons, if you had never dipped into technology that is used to create graphic art? Would you ever know whether you have a talent for it? So we have to take the step with our passion, because God makes those passions inside us. That's part of creation. And then we kind of make some missteps maybe, but we move forward, and God teaches.
It works out in the big picture. It really does. And there's a lot more teachings in Brit Hadashah that along the line of this, and there's a lot more teachings in the Torah and the prophets as well. So I'm hoping to set a paradigm, which is why I've chosen 3 paths of 3 very different people in the Bible, and kind of we can examine them and think about them and consider, how they walked with God. Because we're all learning from each other and from other people as well. And I think Bible is full of these really awesome examples. So what is what I want to say? Functional categories. Let me explain that a little bit to you. So there's this idea of callings, there's this idea of gifts, there's all sort of, there are various terminologies that we use, but I want you to think about functional categories, because when we get to the point of actual living life, or functioning as a society, as a cohesive group of people, we have farmers, we have craftsmen, right? We have shepherds, we have fishermen, we have soldiers, we have mothers, we have men, women, children, adults. Are any of those callings, would you like to rank as being lower or higher or anything like that? That's not really how it is, right? All these people are important because they're actually doing something that only they can do. All of these categories of people, they have different functions, and they all have different tasks, they have different responsibilities before God, completely different responsibilities. The children's responsibilities before God is very different than parental responsibilities before God. You recognize that, right? things like that. All of a sudden we start recognizing that in that diversity, there's a diversity of how a person is living out their faith, appropriate to whoever they are. And neither one is more important than the other in the grand scheme of things. We may rank them based on whatever our system that we think about, but actually neither one of them is more important. We could say, parents are more important than children, right? Why? Because they're parents, because they're in charge, because they get to boss children around. But guess what? Parents get older, children grow up, and things reverse, right? And they go on, and they make more children, but the parents are gone now. So who is more important then? You get the idea. We could place value judgments on these things, but those value judgments are completely superficial based on just how we perceive it at the moment. So the same is with the body of Messiah. Should everyone become a Jew? Why should everyone seek to identical calling and function? Why should everyone want to? Why can't the nations worship Israel's God as the nations? Why is that possible? That was the vision of the prophets. That's what I want you to realize, because that is not something new. This is not something that Shaul came up with. This is not something that distinction theologians have come up with. It's something that's built in all throughout the Bible. So here's one for you. You probably would know this one. Ein kamocha ba'elohim Adonai ve'en kema'asecha. We sing that, right, when we open the ark. You know this one? You know this one. Yeah. There is no one like you among the gods, O Lord, nor are there any works like you. We sing that. You know what the rest says? It says, Kol goyim asher asita yavo v'yishtachavu l'fanecha Adonai v'yichavdu l'shemecha ki gadol ata v'aseh niflaot ata Elohim levadecha. All the nations that you have made shall come and worship before you, O Lord, and they shall glorify your name, for you are great and do wondrous deeds. You alone are God. God is God alone. And if people are going to worship him, if they're meant to worship him, if his whole entire creation is meant to worship him, that means the nations are going to work together with Israel. So, when we open the ark, we're seeing these verses, and then, like I said, the continuation is right there. This is the vision of the prophets. It's just the psalmist happens to sing it this time, right? But this is not at all unusual if you read the words of Zechariah or Isaiah or Jeremiah or any of those prophets. They talk about a time when the nations come alongside of Israel and they all worship one God together. But they all come as the nations. They don't become Israelites. They still live in their lands that they were allotted to. They speak the languages they were allotted to. They don't all move to Jerusalem, to Me'asharim. See? Because there's just not enough room in Me'asharim. Just not going to happen. They don't all settle on top of Yamin Moshe, as beautiful as that place is. Okay? I love that place, but there's a diversity that God has implied from the beginning of time. And we see that diversity in the end of days, not just in the beginning of times. And if we deny this very simple truth, then, and try to make it whatever we think should be done, then perhaps we're working against a design that is built in implicitly into what we can call biblical theology, these ideas. Yes, Jimmy?
So, it's interesting. We read these scriptures from thousands of years ago, and we oftentimes impose our modern lens.
Yeah.
So we've, by and large, lost the distinction of our ethnic, you mentioned the 70 nations.
Yeah.
Most of us have no knowledge of where we fit in there. Unless you have a clear line of descent, to, like you're Cohen, for example.
Right.
When we look at this, we think of nation as like a landmass,
Yes.
from Ireland or whatever.
Yes.
This is not talking about. Now, sometimes there's a landmass that correlates to your nation, so to speak, but it's ethnos in Greek. It's I don't. What's the Hebrew word there?
Goyim.
Goyim. Yeah.
Right
So,
there. Kol Goyim.
Yep.
That's all the nations. All the nations. And that's so Kol Goyim, and then have a long list. Let's list the 70 ones, right? And then they just keep going. We don't think that way. You're right, because we look at it generically, and depending on translation, it will smooth it out even more. And I want you to see that. And this is sort of an illustration of what I'm talking about.
I think some of the reason why that unity and diversity thing, we strayed for that. It took me like 20 years before I was okay with God not creating me a Gentile. I wanted to be, I've been in Messianic congregations since the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really, literally, at least 2 decades where, why wasn't I Jewish? And there's something, Gentile, there was, if I was a Gentile, it was not as good.
Not as good.
But, it finally realized me, and I don't know how it happened, but God loves me as much as he does a Jewish person. I have a role. I see myself throughout the scriptures, in these. And once I got rid of that, maybe envy, I don't know, wanting to be, I'm less than, I don't know. And I see that happens a lot in Messianic congregations. That's why I'm really little, when I see Gentiles, acting the same way I did.
Right. You recognize it.
I'd be more compassionate, but I'm not. I'm really irritated. No.
But here you are, Wendy, bearing your soul to us, and I appreciate your level of transparency, sharing who you are. But you are in a different place now.
Yeah.
You have gone to the next level, and you understood that these distinctions, they're functional. They're functional. That's what they are. We are meant to function one way. Israel has a function to fulfill.
What a transition. Before all of this, who ever had envy to be a Jew? All of us didn't, we were like, don't tell anybody I'm a Jew, because we didn't want you to get a bullseye on you. But so for people that actually want to be Jewish, it's like something has, a corner's been turned here.
Rabbis teach that only the converts that convert during the days of persecution are true converts. All the others, they're not. Because God is not going to validate. Maybe they converted, maybe they did went through all the steps, but God is still going to look at them as everybody else. But those who said, you know what, these people are reviled, they're persecuted, I still want to be part of them, and they went through that step, and it's not necessary, but they decided to do that. There's a special honor in that, and I understand that, and that's wonderful. But it's what we're talking about. In a sense, there are these different functional categories, and that's what I want people to understand. They're not moral categories. They're not, because it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with what you're supposed to do, what function you serve. And once people start seeing that, all of a sudden, they're like, okay, that doesn't bother me anymore. Like today, you're not bothered by this anymore, where you say, honestly, that you have been bothered for a long time. And I get it. I totally understand where you are. Yes, Jeremy, and then you, Mike. Yes.
So, I think we've all struggled with identity over the years, but, coming from a mixed background myself, having Jewish ancestry and non-Jewish ancestry flowing through my veins, sometimes that presents an identity struggle, right? Yeah. And even if you have Jewish ancestry, there's lots of,
a lot of things in that bag.
Right. And so, you amidst these struggles, I think it's an opportunity to grow.
Yes, it is.
And when we realize that, God has sovereign over all of this, and we don't always see what he's actually seeking to accomplish. And, one of the things that helped me, and this had a personal connection in my background, my family were importers of wine and spirits, so very prominent labels. And I remember reading a theologian speaking about, why did God choose the Jewish people? Was this divine favoritism? And he says, no. Why does a French winemaker from the Champagne region or whatever choose an exclusive importer to bring a product to a country? Why? Why not many to facilitate greater sales? I think we all know why. You want to go buy a $120 bottle of Dom Perignon or whatever, you want to ensure the integrity of the product. And if you see the name of that importer, who, by the way, there's a lot of regulations and laws around that. Notice a lot of Jewish lawyers out there?
Yeah.
Well, there's a litigious people. God required a litigious people to be the importers of his product. The product of the Messiah, the product of the Torah. And so, they get particular, my family enjoyed the product too. But it wasn't exclusively for them. So.
Amazing analogies. What can I say? Amazing analogies. We draw these connections. You, ma'am.
God wasn't surprised that I wasn't born Jewish, you know?
Of course not.
So he had a purpose for making me Turkish, Lebanese, and Italian.
There you go.
You know, two different spiritual groups that fought with each other and killed each other. He wasn't surprised at all about any of that. And like it says in the Bible, the eye doesn't say to the foot, I have no need for you.
Exactly.
We're all part of the body, which I was trained was the body of Christ.
Right.
Different functions.
And we can take that metaphor to to other ideas and connect the dots basically. Drake, were you holding your hands? Are you good? Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, my time is up. Let's wrap it up. I'll pick this up where we stopped next time. How about that? We'll just keep rolling with this stuff. You're having a good time and good discussion, so we'll be traveling down these roads some more.